the video. Ja, meine sehr verehrten
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event in the Hessian representation. And I would also like to welcome everyone following along at home online. This event is being simultaneously interpreted into English. So if you're following along on YouTube, you can click a channel to get English interpretation. That way you'll be able to follow along. Most of our speakers will speak German. One of our participants will speak English, and you can, in that case, if you need it, choose the German interpretation. As a brief introduction to our topic, new times of crisis, new forms of radicalization. This is a topic that keeps coming back in recent years, and in recent days particularly. When I say recent years, I think about violence during COVID protests. That's something that happened here in Belgium. Some of you may remember. And Fête de la Boum, as it was called, that led to a massive confrontation between the young people and the police. And there was much more violence, for instance, in the Netherlands, where many cities were shaken by an incredible scope of brutality against police and security forces never seen before. And this certainly is linked to a new form of radicalization. Currently, as you may have noticed following the news in Belgium, there have been several attacks on schools in Charleroi and Liège, 6 in Charleroi, I believe 2 in Liège. And the motivation behind this is most of all, if you can call it motivation, because it is mostly violence motivated by mandatory sexual education that has been decided by the Berlin government at the beginning of the month for pupils in the 4th and 6th grades. And amongst social media, there was the misunderstanding that this would affect children from the ages 4 to 6, not grades 4 to 6. And these were, of course, alarming events. Sunday there was a demonstration here in Brussels where you could see many veiled women, but not only veiled women. It was quite a mixed public that was demonstrating, and I don't want to say that these people support violence, but this is a phenomenon that shows that we are dealing with new forms of radicalization, new groups, maybe even new alliances. This is something we want to take a closer look at today, not from a political perspective, but from a scientific perspective that has been working on this for some time. The introduction today for today's event will be given by Minister Lucia Puttrich, who cannot be here in person, but who sent a video.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe
Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our crisis talk in the representation of the state of Hesse in Brussels. I'd like to thank our partners from the Leibniz community and the Goethe University Frankfurt am Main. I would like to especially thank Professor Jung, who is blessing us with his contributions to today's event after the Islamist terror attacks 2015 in Paris, 2016 in Brussels and Berlin. Things appear to have calmed down. Extremist organizations seem to have faded into the background due to other crises, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that is not a correct observation. Radicalization and terrorism continue to threaten our society. Extremists continue to utilize internet platforms and services to communicate, to recruit new members, and to spread propaganda. and also to network with each other. A brief look at TikTok can show very obvious hatred and this is a platform that is the #1 popular platform for young people. And we have had experiences with that type of terror in Hessen as well. The assassination of Kassel District President Walter Lübcke in 2019 and the terrorist attack on Hanau in 2020 are examples of that, which is why the state of Hessen has strengthened the State Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the State Criminal Police Office, and the judicial system. Furthermore, several prevention programs have been launched. It's very important to have an exchange between practice, science, and research, and to have a tightly knit cooperation between the state and society on all levels. A good example for this is the new federally unique research site for extremism resiliency and prevention under Hessian University for Public Administration and Security in Mülheim am Main. This place is directed by Professor Jung. And this research center started its work in June of this year, which is why I'm very much looking forward to Professor Jung's keynote speech. Ladies and gentlemen, radicalization and extremism are European phenomena. The people who left the European Union to join the jihad came from all member states, or almost all member states of the European Union, which is why it's important and correct to take a closer look at this topic here in Brussels as well. I hope you'll all have an interesting event and an interesting discussion. Yes, the keynote speech will be given by Professor Dr. Julian Jung. Your institute has been mentioned by Minister Puttrich, the Research Institute for Extremism, Resiliency and Prevention at the Public Administration and Security Institute. You're also part of the Foundation for Peace and Conflict Research. And you'll be setting up the global context.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gutschker. I'd like to thank Minister Puttrich too. She spoke about the scientific and societal challenges that lie ahead of us. We're going to dig a bit deeper. I'll just provide a short speech, and then Andreas Zick is going to take the floor. I'd like to welcome all the people present here and watching online. Thank you very much for allowing us to be once again in the representation of Hess. It was a pleasure to be able to prepare this event together with the team from Leibniz and Hess. And it is a pleasure to be able to welcome all of you on behalf of all of the different associations. There's so many scientists that have been working on this topic. The Research Network for Environment, that's why we also call it the Crisis Talk, that is organized by the Leibniz Institute on behalf of the Research Association Normative Order. Rebecca Schmidt is here as its head. And then we also have the RADIS Research Network, which Andreas Zick and I represent here today. RADIS is financed by the German Ministry for Education. It encompasses over 100 researchers that deal with the question of the extremism in Europe and beyond. Andreas Zick and myself are extremely proud of the fact that with our teams, we managed to build up a network of research which is required. In the 4 years that we've been working on this, we experienced transformation, and we'll certainly speak about that in more detail. We could see that different extremist movements are increasingly feeding each other. More about that later too. And that brings us also to today's topic. How to deal with radicalization in times of crises. Radicalization phenomena are closely tied to transatlantic phenomena. Parts of extremist streams, this is particularly the case for Islamism, there are no borders. With the internet, these phenomena are becoming more and more international. They have very important ties that can be found all over the world. And we see that different crises, including the refugee crisis, migration crisis, we often hear of the multiple crises that come together, and all of that, of course, has an effect on extremism. That is why we need to focus on the interplay between all of the international processes, whilst also considering the perspective outside of Europe. But of course, at the same time, it is important that we focus on Europe today. European societies are faced with many challenges and extremism. We have seen that there have been a lot of societal debates about extremism, societal cohesion, and how to deal also with right-wing populism. All of these are, of course, very controversial terms. We see that there are a number of challenges for the liberal society and democracy. We see more delegitimization and increased attacks on institutions and representatives of democracies, especially when the ones attacking are finding more and more popularity in the center of our societies. If you take a look at Islamism, terror attacks and violent occurrences, especially when you take at physical violence, well, this is all reducing. However, Islamic propaganda is increasing. More young people today are growing up in democracy-distanced and radicalized environments. Our thesis today is that these convictions increase in times of crises, cross-phenomena. What do I mean with that? I mean right-wing extremism, Islamic extremism, and other extremisms. As we know, based on our research, extremisms infect each other and influence each other. What appears today in Islamic extremism could appear tomorrow in right-wing extremisms. These have also been the results of our network. And that is also why extremism prevention must not only be coordinated at a European level, we also need networks at a local level. This is difficult, but very much required in this interplay. And when it comes to tackling these challenges, Andreas Zick is certainly best suited to tell us more about this. He works at the University of Bielefeld, an institution very much focusing on interdisciplinary violence research. Andreas is certainly at the core of research in the areas of extremism and many others. Thank you very much for being here, Andreas, in order to provide us with your input for the ensuing panel discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to give you the floor. Thank you very much, dear Julian. I know many other great experts, and we'll definitely hear a little bit from them during the panel. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to Brussels. For me, Brussels is the location of European democracy, and that is why it is something very special for me that I may be here today. I have about 10 minutes to provide you with my views. And before that, I'd like to speak about the following aspects that I will be mentioning in my speech. It might be useful to perhaps say at what I look at in order to understand the correlation between crises and radicalization. So I will tell you what and in what direction I'm looking at. That might also lead to less anger about the aspects I won't mention. I'd also like to explain why I'm overburdened with the topic when it comes to crises. Then I'm going to speak about how crises and radicalization phenomena are closely tied according to the current state of the research. And then I'd also like to say about what can be done. Let me start with my perspective. I speak to you as an empirical research focusing on conflict and violence. We research different types of radicalization in the ideological, motivated, and violence-oriented extremism. We're particularly interested in the factors that cause radicalization, and we always think of different factors. Personal factors, what roles do psychological motives play? We consider social factors, ties to groups and experiences of discrimination, and then we also think of contextual factors such as poverty and inequality. But there's also another question, and that is one of our projects, and that is how areas, how spaces can promote radicalization. That would be it with regards to my perspective. Now, secondly, why am I overburdened in times of crisis? I have to admit that the topic, the central question of the crisis talk, titled Times of Crises, Times of Radicalism, well, this over-challenges me. Not because I do not have any knowledge. We know quite a bit about the different causes of radicalization in the framework of crises. We know that there is no one general factor. We have a number of analyses about Islamic radicalization, and it is clear that poverty, for example, does not automatically lead to radicalism. And we also know that the very much disseminated frustration-aggression hypothesis isn't true. Secondly, I'm also overburdened because we still lack data, facts, and models in order to provide more reliable, scientifically reliable replies. We have a lack of cooperation between science, authorities, and the civil society. I'm not complaining. This is me pleading and asking for more help. I myself spent a lot of time in Brussels and Den Haag because we have developed a European risk assessment procedure, which we also tested in prisons, etc. And of course, I'm asking for more funding. By the way, Hess was a great contribution in the framework of this project. Thirdly, I'm also overburdened because times of polycrises accelerate radicalizations incredibly. I'd now like to speak about my analytical viewpoint. Back to the question, how do crises and radicalizations relate to each other? And I recommend thinking about what crises actually stand for. These are moments and times where stability and normality seem to be dissolving. The future is uncertain, or at least it appears to be. Decisions appear to be required, but they also do not appear to be secure because routines all of a sudden are no longer to be observed. We see dissatisfaction, a lot of distrust. People call for hard rules and clear decisions, and that even though exactly these aren't possible, in times of crises, the subjective appreciation or interpretation is also incredibly important. In these times, processes of political distancing can accelerate because the uncertainty isn't correctly assessed, and extremist groups take advantage of that. Wars, catastrophes, and political instabilities generate extremism. Why? Well, because they are an opportunity for extremist groups to pick up people. European democracies are affected by that in their center. Aside from extremism, and we heard this in the introduction, we have observed protests, more non-voters, a loss of trust, as well as attacks of institutions that go hand in hand with democracies. And we know this For example, during the financial crisis in 2007, we saw an uprise of nationalist authoritarian populism. A similar phenomenon could be observed during the refugee crisis, with an increase of attacks on people and objects of value. The corona crisis led to protests that went hand in hand with a delegitimization of democracy, and of course also promoted new movements on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And even in the framework of the climate crisis, we see that rationality is being replaced with ideology in many parts of our societies. We can see that we have polycrises. What does that mean? That means that they are connected to each other regardless of what individual extremist groups think. The Global Risks Landscape Report of the World Economic Forum reports that according to the opinion of over 1,200 experts, most catastrophes, shocks and surprises are going to increase over the next 10 years. Only 9% were of the opinion that democracies would leave these crises behind them with more resilience. And of course, this is being promoted by digitalization of the extreme people. On the basis of radicalization research, and especially with regards to Islamic radicalization, we know that frustration, fear of deprivation, triggers radicalism, but that is only possible because these extremist groups make offers in these times and take advantage of it. What we know is that structural, social, as well as personal crises do have an effect, but only if they are turning points and triggers for movements trying to pick them up. But what is decisive for radicalization is the question how radical groups exert pressure, and we realize that this always comes down to what offers are being made. And in the course of these offers being made to these people, we do realize that there's always this image of hostility. According to the studies of Jocelyn Bélanger and Ariel Kudansky and others, radicalization can be explained by how extremist groups serve needs, what networks they offer, as well as what narratives they offer when it comes to the state of the world. And crises, of course, allow for this to prosper. Now, what do we observe with regards to the specific extremism in the context of crises? With regards to Islamist radicalization, the colleague Elif Tariado points to the fact that the central drivers of this radicalization is changing, or are changing, in the new generation. Islamist groups have managed to build up structures that offer groups and persons local security as well as parallel societies. Paths into this extremism work because they're being accompanied by a transformation of disintegration as well as the feeling of pointlessness. And we can see that this doesn't have to have a terrorist nature. We see, for example, that there is that offer of benediction as well, as was being offered by ISIS, but Corinne Torrekens could perhaps tell us more about that later. And the radicalization processes aren't all that different for right-wing extremism. It managed to anchor itself at a local level. Because of these polycrises, it organizes its life, or the life of its members, through different offers relating to helping people in times of crises. In our analysis of incarcerated persons that were in jail because of a right-wing extremist deed, but that weren't organized, well, we could see that the perpetrators found the legitimization for their deeds from the center. And now we have a new extremism in the center of our societies. The day after tomorrow, we're going to release a study about this. I'm not allowed to say more about this. This was my short advertisement. But we can see that new ideologies are being created, such as so-called Völkisch movements, that aren't simply comparable with right-wing populism or extremism. They believe that democracy no longer exists, and they're also tied to the idea that the political expression of anger is an expression of opposition. Now, what matters when I look at the connection between crises and radicalization? I said, let's take a look at what we mean with crises. I believe that it's important to better understand how crises can be navigated, because there are other possibilities of crisis navigation. In democracies, we know that one mode is solidarity as well as expertise to be educated wherever education is being offered. But we do see that nationalism takes advantage of this. And that is why we can see that crises are being navigated by isolating yourself from others. I'm getting signs that I need to come to an end. Now, what can be done? Of course, it is important to continue investing into research, coordination, and cooperation. A lot more is possible in this area. We are currently founding networks of knowledge, which we should also have at a European level. But in times of crises, education is the most important. We can see that radicalization is becoming younger. And that is why education can be a good response to combating extremism. Thank you very much indeed.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Professor Zick. We will continue with our panel discussion, and I'd like to welcome 2 other participants. But before we get to that, I would like to tell all of you that if you're following along online, you have the possibility to send in questions. There should be a slide on screen right now with the email address and the phone number, and you can call if you would like to ask a question. And we will have some time set aside for questions at the end of the discussion. But before that, let's get into this panel discussions. And therefore, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Corinne Torrekens, Director of the Group for Research on Ethnic Relations, Migration and Equality at the Free University of Brussels. And there's a focus in her research on Islamist radicalization. And we also have Dr. Christiane Höhn, Chief Advisor to the EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator and the Council of the European Union. Also a very specific view and a lot of experience with radicalization, as well as the legislation trying to tackle that topic that has been worked on in recent years as a consequence of terror attacks. I would like to start with you, Ms. Torrekens. we've heard that crises and different factors are in interplay with each other. And we haven't had any bigger Islamist attacks in Europe for a while, but we still observe phenomena of radicalization. And we've briefly mentioned it earlier. You might remember last year during the Soccer World Championship, there have been violent protests by young Moroccans in Brussels after a victory by the Moroccan team against the Belgian team. So a situation where you would really not expect that kind of reaction. And these protests continued for several matches. And Belgian authorities did not expect that at all. Do you have an explanation for that? Is this a phenomenon that is also linked to crises? Maybe COVID had an influence on that type of protest, or is this just something that is sui generis?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, is it working? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for this first question. Already a program in itself. I would say, firstly, that I would be very careful not to label every phenomenon as radicalization, a radicalization process. I think, as it was firstly explained by Professor Andreas Zick, radicalization is focused on and is based on an ideology, a political project, and a structure, an organization or groups. That's the three, very basis elements to talk about radicalization. So I would not label the protests we had a couple of months, a couple of years of radicalization. What happened certainly is a combination of factors of social anxiety. It was a bit after the COVID, and the relations with the police and the young people, and especially young people of foreign descent, were very tense. They were already tense in the past because of a lot of things, but these areas in Brussels, those districts, those poor districts that you know very well in Brussels, they were particularly targeted with control and with control measures. So I think there was a lot of anger that can explain a bit what we have observed at that moment. So the first introductive word that I would add to this aspect is being careful about labeling certain phenomena as radicalization.
Ja, vielen Dank. Gleichwohl steht.
Thank you. If there is violence, that's the way I understood Professor Zick's introduction, isn't just the presence of massive violence a sign of radicalization? Maybe we're asking for too much if we require an ideology as a basis. Looking at COVID protests, we've seen that people who were mobilized through social networks, who cooperate with other organized groups in the Netherlands, who've cooperated with hooligans, but who themselves might not follow or even have an ideology. So how do you establish the connection between violence and radicalization without ideology?
This is why I will not call that radicalization. I think we have to remain careful, because if we label everything as, or a lot of different phenomena as radicalization, then radicalization does not mean anything anymore. That's very important. We had the same problem with the word terrorism. I mean, and especially in certain contexts, what you would consider, what is defined as terrorist activities, you will certainly not target that or label that terrorist activities in our societies. So I know it's not always easy to define a phenomenon, and of course researchers take always a bit of time to progress and to analyze new data, but I will not call that radicalization. It's not saying, I'm not saying that it's not a problem. I'm not saying that the presence of violence was not a problem in those moments, but we have to be careful, and this is why I always, and this is what I teach to my students, radicalization is related to an ideology, a political project, and structures, a group, organization. And for example, during the COVID, we had in Brussels protests, but it was in a very nice area of Brussels, the Bois de la Cambre, that you know very well. And it was a huge, a certain level of violence, especially regarding the police. And it can be explained by the social context and what we have experienced during these COVID times. But again, I would not label that as radicalization.
Okay, vielen Dank. Darüber.
Thank you. This is, of course, something we can discuss in this panel, but I would like to include Dr. Höhn. Radicalization has to be defined. This is also true for terrorism. That's really the first step. That's something that the EU member states didn't do easily or easily agree on, but still, as a consequence of terrorist attacks, there has been some legislation. I remember a regulation in particular, the online terrorist content, which is that it's mandatory for internet service providers to remove terrorist content within 24 hours, which is really going into subsidiarity of the member states. And but something that the states also pushed for. This has been active since July last year, I believe. Can we already see what these initiatives have as an effect in the fight against radicalization and extremism in these times of crisis? Yes, thank you. Now, what we can observe is that online radicalization is one of the most important vectors, which is why the European Union has made an effort in recent years. And these efforts culminate, or rather are based on a dialogue with internet forums and platforms where there is an exchange of the worries, where the providers explain the measures they're taking, where also smaller providers are taken, are welcome, and where the different sized providers cooperate. But voluntary cooperation isn't sufficient because the contents are still available, and we can see that there's a lot more connections to disinformation, to conspiracy theories, to hate speech, to influence from abroad, which is something that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is also very well represented online. And this mixture is something that the EU tries to tackle. One pillar is legislation, as you've mentioned. And the member states have to signal the internet providers if, for example, there has a video posted by Daesh, then it has to be taken off a line within 24 hours. The Commission will present a study in a few weeks how this is supposed to be implemented. But fundamentally, it cannot solve the problem if it's only based on flagging by the states, because the providers also have to moderate the content. Another important pillar are the algorithms that these companies have for hate speech, hate content, conspiracy theories. All of that is enormously well spread across the internet, and there is now the idea of having an audit of algorithms to block and prevent these. And we hope that this will create more experience and more ability to limit radicalization. Can you already tell us if there are any numbers that would allow us an estimate of how well this worked, how well you can remove terrorist content. Is there just a small number of cases? Are we talking about hundreds of cases? How far did implementation go this year? I'm going to have to answer this in multiple layers. I don't have any numbers for the flagging of content provided from government flagging contents to companies. But this is really just a drop in the bucket. There are tens of thousands of pieces of content uploaded in a single hour. So flagging cannot be a solution. This is really about the companies developing better content moderation policies where they use AI to find that kind of content and to take it offline. And if you have borderline content that is extremism, that this is not being strengthened and boosted by algorithms, which is something that's still happening. Problem we have is with right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism, which is rather difficult to see if this is terrorist content, because if you look at Daesh, it's always very clear. So the EU has developed a handbook that shows the symbols that allow for taking these contents down. And this allows to put right-wing extremist organizations on a list that can be more easily, more quickly removed. But there's still a lot of terrorist content on the web, and terrorist content is not subject to freedom of speech. So we're taking first steps, but we do not have a level of success that would allow us to say that there is no radicalization happening online. Otherwise, we wouldn't see all these crises. Online is, I think, a very important keyword here, especially talking about new forms of radicalization, because this may be the most important change that people can organize through open and closed forums. In the Netherlands, during COVID protests, people were organizing over Telegram, and this was controlled and managed. They were planning where they would attack security against the protests. Is this a factor in your research? Well, this is an amplifying factor. This is building. The internet builds structures. And this is very well known in right-wing extremism. In the 90s already, there were right-wing extremist websites that were way more spread than the websites of democratic parties. Right-wing extremism already in the 90s was organized over the web. We're facing two new developments today. One is that extremist organizations have become very professional. Like, if one thing disappears, and that's unavoidable, because it's not really possible otherwise, but something else will pop up. And what we know is that they look for other forms. We know that for Islamic terrorism, that if one platform isn't going to work anymore, they coordinate via gaming consoles and coordinate their attacks on that platform. They find very innovative approaches to this. And the IS had developed these types of communication, these forms of organization. There's also a second point, because extremism keeps on growing and it's getting younger and more educated. And in the social organization of young people and their socialization, the world online is real to them. Everything that happens, this is where you encounter the state. This is where you encounter politicians. This is where I build and find my political opinions, where I have an exchange. This is perceived as real by young people, and that's a completely new challenge. We shouldn't have that approach that there is the real world on one hand and the internet on the other. If we react into one, we are protecting the other. There are crimes happening on the internet. There's hate speech, there's denigration, defamation. All that is happening on the internet. It's damaging people, it's damaging the reputation of institutions. And there were lists of names. There's a lot of crimes, digital crimes happening. And this means that these measures, or rather when such a law happens, there has to be prosecution. And that means you have to strengthen the authorities responsible for these authorities. We really have to strengthen them because we have files in the courts that are piling up that still have to be viewed, still have to be worked. And the world online cannot be separated from the real world anymore. We have people that are only extremists online at home. And if you look at the terrorist attacks, right-wing extremist terrorist attacks, all of the preparation is happening online. All the communication is online. Only the assassination is taking place in the real world. Well, that's a topic that the European Union has been looking at for some time now. There's an initiative, hate speech, hate crimes, that these should be EU crimes according to Article 88 of the treaties. This is not something that has been decided yet, but if it happens, this will create the possibility to have shared European penalties and sentences for this, because legislation can be very different amongst member states, and something that you've shown here is that it's necessary to have a European discourse and discussion on this and to get our norms closer to this. Ms. Torrekens, I would like to ask you about the results of your research, because you have worked with criminals that are incarcerated and are trying to get insights on their radicalization, their story of radicalization, given the background of today's discussion of new forms of radicalization. What are your results from this research?
Thank you. There is something I would like to stress, because it was mentioned by Professor Andreas Zick, this idea of distrust. What was very interesting in the interviews we made, so mainly in jail, but not only, we also made semi-structured interviews with people who left the jail, or with some people that were not incarcerated and were not condemned because they returned from ISIS before the criminalization of the departure. What was striking is that they had a huge political interest and even geopolitical interest and interrogations and answers. And at the same time, an important distrust regarding institutions. Government, of course. Police. One guy we met told us that he was already very radicalized before lefting to fight for ISIS. And he said, laughing, yeah, when I had a problem, I cannot call the police because I do not trust them. They are traitors in my point of view. So that's quite difficult to be a radical people, because you cannot call the police when you have a problem, because you distrust this institution. With the school education system, so this, and even what was very important for us, and certainly with imams, so with the religious authorities and the religious institutions, and we collected a lot of videos and of material of the groups that were very active in Belgium, threatening the imams to be traitors because they were loyal to Belgium or to the European societies. So that was one aspect that was very interesting and quite difficult to work on, because how do you work on distrust when those guys will remain a lot of years in jail with very few perspectives, with very few activities, and in certain social conditions in jails? I guess that you know a bit the situation and the reports about the situation in jails in Belgium, which is not always very easy.
Welche Rolle spielt?
What is the role of the internet for the groups that you're dealing with? Perhaps you could tell us more about that. What about these perpetrators that you interview? What is their background? And what role does the internet play for their radicalization?
So the background is very diverse. I really would like to insist. Professor Andreas Zick also said that in his introduction. There is no general profile or a common profile. There are different personalities, some with already past criminal activities, others not at all. Some were, to say it quite easily, they were already de-radicalized in a certain way, saying it was a part of my life, it's not the case anymore. I would like to keep going on and to forget a bit this part of my life. So very different profiles. And the role of internet was a bit more difficult for us to assess because we met them in jail with no possibilities for them, legally speaking. Reality is always be different, but no possibility for them normally to connect and to be connected on internet. That was not the most striking point. The most striking point was what they read, what they were asked to read, and linked to the internet, the role made by some videos. And what was very interesting is to come back to the role of internet, was the possibilities, and it's linked with this idea of distrust and distrust in religious institutions. Internet and social networks and media on internet like YouTube, for example, they just gave the opportunity to people having no background at all in Islamic law, in the fiqh, to wake up in the morning and to give speeches about how to be, why imams are tweeters, what it is to be a real Muslim, etc., etc. So that was very something related to what we study in sociology of religion and sociology of Islam especially, is linked to individualization of faith and individualization of practices, sometimes for the best, sometimes for the worst.
Mhm. Frau Höhn, wir haben jetzt in der Tat seit einiger Zeit keine...
Now, indeed, we haven't had any bigger terrorist attacks of late. After many years of terrorist attacks. Now, why do you think that is the case? Is that linked to repression? Is that linked to the successful fight against the Islamic State, against ISIS or other terrorist groups, or were we simply lucky? Thank you very much. 2015 and 2016, bigger attacks that were planned in Syria could be orchestrated and then implemented here in Europe. We had an external threat that then found its way here in Europe in the framework of these bigger attacks. There were many Europeans and people from all over the world that traveled to ISIS in order to be trained there and to fight there. Because the anti-Daesh coalition successfully eliminated the Daesh, Al-Qaeda and Daesh at the moment doesn't have the possibility to orchestrate attacks from abroad in Europe. And that is why the attacks that we saw over the last years, well, these were committed by people that were radicalized here, people from smaller groups. We also saw that attacks were prevented, or we had individual perpetrators that were not necessarily part of a bigger structure. And that is why the terrorist attacks were perhaps a tad less lethal. A lot was also done. We could see that stricter laws were passed, including a prohibition of access to explosion substances. Also, the borders were strengthened when terrorists came from abroad. These could be easily identified at the borders. All of this, of course, contributed. But it is not time to rest on our laurels, because we are very worried about Daesh in Afghanistan. And they're currently focusing on that region. But it may well be that at some point they will also be able to organize attacks here. And then there's also a ticking time bomb of radicalization, and these are the camps and the prisoners in northern eastern Syria, Al-Hol, for example, where there's still 50,000 families, so to speak, women and children. European states took a lot of them back, but there are still many from Iraq and Syria and third countries that are in these prisons, and the Daesh considers them the young generation that can be indoctrinated there and now, and that is why it is one of our priority to help Iraq get the people back and to find a solution for this camp. Against this background, the threat remains serious, but what we see now was partially the result of the measures we have undertaken. Professor Zick, in your introductory statement, you alluded to the role of the hope for benediction, that people would be saved, that would go and fight. Now there's no more caliphate that you can really point to. Now I think this was also a tactical mistake of ISIS to draw this caliphate in such a way. This meant that the salvation expectation kind of disappeared. But allow me to add one more thing. We saw that great efforts were undertaken. When Islamist terror came to Europe, great efforts were undertaken. We even had a research association for it. And that is something I would very much wish for other forms of extremism. If we take a look at how much was created, consultation offers, also people wanting to leave ISIS and all of that. We must also consider the fact that terrorism is in a constant internal conflict. In the area of Islamist radicalization, there's a lot of victims because of internal extremist group conflicts that play a decisive role. We are in Europe. We shouldn't forget that ISIS withdrew to other areas outside of Europe and is continuing to organize there. And that is also why we as Europeans should make our know-how available externally. I think this would be a great project to organize. And of course, in Europe too, we find ourselves in crises. And I'd have to ask my colleague, but my assumption is that, of course, traces remain. We have settlements, so to speak. And terrorist attacks might not be quite as interesting in these times. Reforms are taking place. This could be an interim phase. But we also have these surveillance systems, which have been expanded, but in other areas we do not have them. And what really works well, I forgot one group, which I have to mention. I'm interrupting you. But of course, we had civil societal groups that did a whole lot here too. We had civil societal offerings. We spoke about the media, the internet, and we could see that a lot of work was done in civil society, working in the area of prevention. And that is a great European model. that is a model that we can explain to others as well. This interplay between state funding, legal changes, and civil society, which does a lot of the prevention intervention work. In my opinion, this is a well-functioning model at a European level and can offer help in times of crisis. You also said that solidarity is perhaps the biggest resource that a society has at its disposal in order to combat this. We have received one question from a viewer, which I would like to offer to you. Ms. Torrekens, I think you might be well suited to reply to this question. Sabine Merz asked this question, and I'll simply read it out. She writes, "It is my impression that the behavior of the police also often causes anger here in Belgium, as well as in France and Germany. Arab and dark-skinned Belgians are treated differently to white-skinned Belgians. We observe clear racism here that causes frustration and anger, and that, of course, undermines trust in the police forces. You yourself described mistrust in police and state institutions. Now, are there trainings? Is there any education when it comes to this topic amongst the police? What's the state of affairs in Belgium here?"
Thank you very much for this question, and it allows me to go a bit more general. I think what is important when we look at radicalization and radicalization process is how our democratic societies are encountering their promises. What they say, what are their principles, what they say, and then what they do. And yes, indeed, there are huge problems in terms of gender equality, and also in terms of ethnic and racial equality, to be very straight to the point. It's also mixed with socioeconomic difficulties and socioeconomic deprivation. And all these problems, they are intersecting and they are interrelated. So that's an issue. And when you have a group, an ideology, whatever, it is an extreme right group or an Islamist group, saying that, well, with us, you will have a way to have an impact. When you distrust political participation, when some of our societies, they criminalize some kind of political participation and mainstream political participation, then all societies in general are in danger. And what we have experienced during COVID times is a huge restriction of our freedom and our rights. And I'm not going to debate, it was certainly necessary. But the thing is that we see that the temptation is still there to use those processes to introduce other legal measures, as we have seen in France, for example. So what we can cherish is our democracies and their principles and the way they function.
Und noch einmal konkret, was...
Now, concretely with regards to the police forces, are there any prevention programs, also as a lesson resulting from these insights that a mistrust is caused, which then again leads to new types of violence? Are there any prevention programs?
We a short research on police and on diversity in police forces in Belgium. So yes, there are improvements, to be very again straight to the points, and there are prevention, there are programs about diversity, for example. The issues are and remain very big because of a lot of problems and a lot of some problems linked to the way recruitment is made in the police. For example, to give you one very practical example, when some police agents, they are recruited in very rural areas of Belgium, and they begin their function in the poorest deprived areas and ethnic diverse areas of Brussels, sometimes the contrast is a bit important, and it's leading to mistrust, misunderstanding, etc. And this is something you are not going to change in a couple of years. It's going to take time, and the means, we come back to this issue, the means are very important to put in those efforts.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir haben eine Stunde lang diskutiert.
Thank you. We've discussed for an hour. We've really only briefly tackled some of the topics, but I think it has become clear, as you've stated clearly, that when we're looking at crises that are no longer happening only on a national level, but that have an influence across the border, it seems obvious to look for a European discussion on these topics, to which we try to contribute. And the researchers want more discussion, more programs, more projects on that level. And just that last question that you answered is a great example how useful it could be to have that discussion on a European level as well, in order to learn from each other, to profit from each other's efforts, sharing best practices, as we always say in the European Union. This is a way to learn from each other. I would like to thank all of you here in the room for your attention, and I would of course also like to thank all people who have watched this online, and I would like to pass the floor to Mr. von Heusinger, Director of the Representation of the State of Hessen.